I'm Alicia Maggard, and I'm a PhD candidate in history at Brown University. My project is titled Technology, Society, and the State in the Steamboat Era. So I am looking at a history of antebellum steam navigation. So that's steamboats on the rivers, some steamships in the coastal and harbor areas. The Kentucky Historical Society is a great place to track steamship travel, steamboat travel, because you have a confluence of river systems and also many industries that are being built up around building steamboats, servicing them, supplying them with fuel, and also bringing in many different kinds of goods for the first time into the kind of vast watershed of the Ohio. I became interested in this topic actually reading early American newspapers, and this is a time when steamboats are kind of the first heavy industrial product that reaches the interior. Railroads are a couple decades off, and factories are still at this point very concentrated in the suburbs of Boston. But steamboats start quickly spreading throughout the interior, and as they spread, they also explode. So the early newspaper accounts of these, Americans have just never seen this kind of concentrated technological destruction. And quickly you get a whole journalism and also pamphlet industry built up around describing these kind of horrific accidents. And I guess it's not very academic of me, but I found that to be fascinating to think about the many benefits that steamboats gave as far as moving goods and connecting people with information, ideas, and products, but also the huge dangers and the kind of fascination with that kind of new industrial era of destruction that they could bring as well. So there's a couple different kinds of sources that really help me understand what early kind of steamboat industrial work was like. So for example, at the Kentucky Historical Society, there are the Harry Innes Todd papers. And Todd is kind of a fascinating figure to track a long history of the steamboat industry. He's kind of born into a well-connected political family in Frankfort, but he finds his earliest employment on the riverboats that would go on the Ohio and Kentucky rivers. So some of his papers include his letters as a steamboat captain, writing to family and friends, but also to agents in New Orleans about river traffic, including about some early steamboat accidents and the kind of economic calculus that they went into trying to attract passengers after major disasters. Later, Todd moves into the coal industry. So he has a brother who says, get out of steamboats, the new industry is going to be supplying them with fuel. And then in a final incarnation of his career, and I think in a way that nicely tracks the way that steamboats are kind of tied into all kinds of economic changes in places like Kentucky, he becomes the supervisor of the state penitentiary. And as that supervisor, he sends convict labor to work on the locks and the canals and to clear them to make it easier for steamboats to pass. So I think it shows kind of how, the economic connections to steamboat travel are there, but also how they're creating new industries in mining and fuel with coal. But finally, the role that state and local governments are playing in making steamboat traffic possible, and the investments in capital, material, and human labor that they're putting into this new industry. The investment of the state in steamboats, I believe, happens nationally, but Kentucky is a particularly good place to study it. So if you have a senator like Henry Clay, who is famous for pushing internal improvements, Kentucky is especially aggressive about building these canals and locks. And I think that with so many waterways and such an interest in reaching the New Orleans market, Kentucky puts particular effort toward building up their waterways and their port cities. So you have the Louisville and Portland Canal, which is kind of allowing you to traverse the dangerous falls of the Ohio near Louisville and Shippingport. But it's also taking place on the Licking and Kentucky rivers. On a national story, I think steamboats are particularly interesting because the waterways that they travel, it is the state that makes these public waterways. So it is the state that is invested in clearing them of snags, in making sure that harbors and river ports don't silt up, in defending that they are public ways. And the railroad, which I think most historians have focused on, is a very different model where the company purchases and builds the railroad tracks. In a way, I think that steamboats are kind of an interesting way to think about the way that public infrastructure is used to private benefit in a way that kind of reminds me more of our highway systems and automobiles of today. So one thing that I really learned from reading the Todd papers is I knew about the commercial work that steamboats did. I knew that they were moving agricultural products to markets and that they were bringing back manufactured goods. But one thing that I hadn't thought about previously is the financial work that steamboats do. There's a great sequence of letters between Todd as a steamboat captain and a riverfront planter named Robert Bates. And Bates writes Todd several times, and he says, "Thank you for stopping and purchasing wood from me. Please let me know if you would like more wood and if you'll stop again." And so the fuel needs of these steamboats that are stopping at small landings as well as at growing cities is creating many transactions. And one thing that steamboats are particularly good about is if you have planters who are generally pretty illiquid during the planting cycle. Cash is scarce at this time, and especially if you are waiting for a crop to make it to market. But a steamboat purchasing small lots of wood for fuel is injecting cash into local economies and becomes part of the financial strategies of people like Robert Bates. There's another good example in the Alexander family papers. The Alexander family is a kind of combination of Kentucky and Scottish gentry, if you will. And they open what's called the Idrie Furnace. And one thing that this furnace is doing is as it's working toward producing iron, a lot of the kind of sustaining early transactions are fueling steamboats, selling coal to the riverboats that pass, and doing small repair work. And the foreman of the Idrie Furnace writes to one of the Alexander family members, the owner, and says, when the river's blocked, they have a very hard time paying their labor force because it's the small bills that steamboat captains use to pay for small repairs or for loads of coal that really grease the wheels of the kind of local labor economy. So those were two instances of the small transactions that steamboats are bringing on river systems throughout the interior that are changing the productive strategies and also the access to cash, which has kind of led me to reconsider those especially fuel regimes that are starting to become important in the interior. My time here was really productive looking at sources, but it was also really helpful to give the presentation. I think that when you do research, you're so much in your own head and there's so many directions that you're unsure about, but getting the feedback from the other historians in residence here and hearing the way that things that I was seeing in the steam navigation industry were resonating with what might be seen in the arms industry during the Civil War, and thinking about the way that it was suggested that places like Frankfurt become intentional choke points, the way that keeping different kinds of traffic stopping at your city. And I think that just having that opportunity to zoom back from a certain industry and to think about what is taking place in the development of Kentucky, but also in antebellum America as a whole, gave me new purchase on areas of my topic that might have greater resonance with American history generally and made me kind of more excited to follow those leads. So one thing that I found here that I felt like was a diamond in the rough was I knew that steamboats themselves had a very short life with the explosions, the dangers of the river, and to be honest, the cheap construction, that they were low capital investments. Most of them only lasted about 4 or 5 years. But the engines and boilers are different. These are expensive. In antebellum dollars, they're about $10,000. And if a whole steamboat runs you only $15,000 or $16,000, you can tell where the real money is being spent. And these are usually cast iron. But those are being salvaged. So if a boat is retired or if it explodes or sinks, often they are pulling those engines and boilers out, and there becomes a robust second-hand market. And so the Idrie furnace purchases for their works a second-hand engine, and they repurpose it from running steamboats to running their foundry. So that was a really exciting find for me. And there's a second reference at the Kentucky Historical Society in the John McCure papers, where he is corresponding with somebody who has purchased an engine for a sawmill, and he's basically going broke. But he's not worried because he thinks he can resell that engine to the railroad that's coming through town. So these were things that I imagined, with how expensive engines were and how short-lived the actual boat vessel was, that they must be reselling these. So that was a really exciting lead to find here, and I followed it at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. And there I found the Jefferson steam engine manufactory, and it was in their financial accounts, and I had to brush up on my antebellum bookkeeping. But in the ledgers and the accounts, I found them repairing engines, buying broken pieces, fixing and reselling them. And this is interesting for me, thinking about explosions and the number of old engines and secondhand and shoddily treated. But it's also interesting on kind of a second emphasis of my research, which is to say that alongside the steamboat, you had to have the industrial knowledge for how to repair them and how to operate them. And I see them as agents that diffused technical knowledge in early America. So in places like Lexington or in places like Louisville, all of a sudden these machine repair shops start up to service the steamboats, and that's really how they make their money in the early years. But after a couple years of working on steamboats, they get the technical know-how, and also they start to build up solid capital reserves. All of a sudden, they start building their own engines and boilers. And the Jefferson Foundry in particular starts to, in the off-season, when steamboats aren't regularly traveling the rivers, so in the winter when they're frozen up, they have a very robust trade with New Orleans sugar makers, sugar planters, and they start building and selling sugar mills to planters in New Orleans. So this kind of industrialization of the South and West is very much built on the expertise and on the money that the steamboat industry brings in.